The massive alien fleet hung in the void above Earth like a collection of dying stars. Each ship stretched for kilometers, their bioorganic hulls pulsing with faint bioluminescent patterns that had once represented the proud glory of the Zephyrian Empire. Now those same lights flickered weakly, like the last breaths of a mortally wounded creature. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of the flagship Eternal Sorrow, his 6 arms trembling as he stared at the blue world below. His species had ruled 17 star systems for over 3,000 years. They had conquered worlds, enslaved populations, and considered themselves the apex predators of their corner of the galaxy. The humans had changed everything. "Admiral," his communications officer whispered, her voice barely audible through the translator implants. "The human vessels are approaching from the lunar orbit." Kethvar closed his 3 eyes and tried to steady his breathing. The humans had given them exactly 24 Earth hours to make their decision. Surrender unconditionally, face immediate extermination, or the third option that no Zephyrian had ever imagined they would consider: beg for forgiveness. The irony was not lost on him. 3 years ago, they had arrived at this same planet with weapons charged and demands ready. The primitive inhabitants of this small blue world were supposed to submit to Zephyrian rule or face annihilation. It should have been simple. It should have taken mere days. Instead, it had been the beginning of the end for everything they thought they knew about the universe. "Sir, incoming transmission from Earth," the communications officer announced. "Put it through," Kethvar replied, straightening his ceremonial robes. Even in surrender, he would maintain what dignity remained to his people. The holographic display activated, revealing a human female with graying hair and tired eyes. Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Force looked exactly like what she was, a warrior who had seen too much war and wanted it to end. "Admiral Kethvar," she said simply, "have you reached your decision?" Kethvar looked around his bridge at the surviving members of his command staff. They had started this war with over 2 million Zephyrian military personnel. Now, fewer than 50,000 remained alive, scattered across 12 damaged vessels that barely qualified as space-worthy. "Admiral Chun," he began, his voice carrying across the quantum communication array to Earth. "The Zephyrian Empire formally requests mercy." The words felt like poison in his throat. In 3 millennia of Zephyrian history, no military commander had ever spoken such words to an enemy. But then, again, they had never encountered an enemy like humanity. "We acknowledge our crimes against your people and your world," Kethvar continued, reading from the prepared statement his council had agonized over for hours. "We request permission to surrender unconditionally and place ourselves at the mercy of Earth's justice system." Admiral Chen nodded slowly. "Your request is acknowledged, Admiral. However, as we discussed, Earth's government has decided that this matter requires a different kind of resolution." Kethvar felt his blood vessels constrict. "What do you mean?" "The crimes committed by your empire extend far beyond Earth, Admiral. Our intelligence networks have uncovered evidence of atrocities on 17 different worlds. Billions of sentient beings enslaved, tortured, or killed. Entire ecosystems destroyed for resources. Civilizations wiped from existence." The Zephyrian Admiral said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every accusation was true. Earth's government believes that justice for such crimes cannot come from us alone, Admiral Chen continued. "We have contacted the representatives of every world your empire has harmed. They will be arriving within the next 72 hours. "Representatives?" Kethvar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The survivors, Admiral. The ones your people left for dead. The civilizations you thought you had destroyed completely." Chen's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that made Kethvar's skin crawl. "They're very eager to meet with you." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Eternal Sorrow in absolute silence. Communications Officer Yellow-TH was the first to speak. "Admiral, what does this mean for us?" Kethvar turned toward the tactical display, where dozens of red dots were approaching from various vectors around the solar system. Ships he didn't recognize, using technologies that weren't in any Zephyrian database. Some moved like liquid mercury through space. Others seemed to phase in and out of visible reality. A few appeared to be made entirely of crystalline structures that defied known physics. "It means," he said quietly, that we are about to face the judgment of our victims. The first alien ship to reach Earth's orbit was unlike anything in Zephyrian records. It resembled a massive tree made of living metal, its branches reaching out in all directions like grasping fingers. As it approached, the ship began to sing, a deep, resonant harmony that penetrated through the hull of the Zephyrian vessels and into the bones of every crew member. "That's a Verdanian world ship," whispered Science Officer Courtmel, his voice filled with disbelief. "But that's impossible. We glass-melted their entire system 8 years ago." "Apparently not all of it," Kethvar replied grimly. More ships began to arrive. A fleet of crystalline vessels that moved like a school of fish through space, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Massive organic constructs that looked more like spacefaring jellyfish than starships. Geometric impossibilities that seemed to exist in more dimensions than standard physics allowed. Each arrival was announced by Admiral Chen's communication array, providing names and histories that Kethvar remembered from military reports and conquest celebrations. The crystalline collective of Zirian Prime, representing the survivors of the Zirian system massacre. The Deep Current, speaking for the aquatic civilizations of the oceanic worlds. The Forge Masters of Kethlar, whose homeworld was strip-mined to fuel Zephyrian industrial expansion. The Memory Keepers, preserving the cultures of 43 extinct species. With each announcement, Kethvar felt the weight of his empire's crimes settling on his shoulders like lead blankets. These weren't the primitive, helpless victims that Zephyrian propaganda had described. These were the survivors, and they had spent years preparing for this moment. The last ship to arrive was perhaps the most disturbing. It appeared as a void in space itself, a ship-shaped absence that seemed to devour light and matter. When it transmitted its identification, the translation came through as simply the Forgotten. "Admiral," Communications Officer Yelatih said, her voice shaking, "we're receiving a general transmission. It's being broadcast to all vessels in the system." "Put it through." The holographic display activated, showing not one speaker, but dozens. Representatives of species the Zephyrians had tried to exterminate, their forms ranging from barely humanoid to completely alien. Some floated in tanks of exotic atmosphere. Others appeared to be made of living stone or crystalline matrix. A few existed as patterns of pure energy contained within specialized projection fields. The speaker who stepped forward was humanoid, but clearly not human. Her skin was bark-like, with small leaves growing directly from her shoulders and scalp. Her eyes were the deep green of ancient forests. "I am Speaker Valandra of the Verdanian survivors," she said, her voice carrying the rustling sound of wind through trees. "I speak for the Victims Alliance, representing the survivors of Zephyrian aggression across 17 star systems." Kethvar straightened his posture. "Speaker Valandra, I am Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy. We are prepared to surrender unconditionally to your alliance." "Surrender?" The bark-skinned woman tilted her head. "Admiral, you misunderstand the situation. We are not here to accept your surrender." "Then, what do you want from us?" The assembled representatives began to speak in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. "We want you to understand what you have done. We want you to feel what your victims felt. We want you to know the true cost of your empire's glory." The transmission ended, leaving the Zephyrian fleet alone with their growing dread. "Admiral," Tactical Officer Murndok announced, "the alien fleets are taking positions around our formation. They're not powering weapons, but..." "Admiral, some of their technologies don't register on our sensors at all." Kethvar nodded grimly. "They don't need to threaten us with weapons, Murndok. They have something much more powerful." "What's that, sir?" "Justice." The first broadcast came 6 hours later. It began as a simple transmission that all Zephyrian vessels received simultaneously. The holographic displays throughout their ships activated, showing scenes that made hardened military veterans weep and seasoned officers vomit. It was Zirian Prime, as it had been before the Zephyrian conquest. The crystalline beings who lived there had created cities that were works of art, their society built on principles of harmony and mathematical beauty. The images showed families of crystal entities raising their young in gardens of living gems, artists creating sculptures from solid light, scholars unlocking the secrets of space-time geometry. Then came the footage of the Zephyrian attack. The images were taken from Zephyrian military recordings, cameras mounted on their own assault craft. Every member of the Zephyrian fleet had to watch their own forces systematically destroying one of the galaxy's most beautiful civilizations. They watched crystal children shatter under plasma fire. They saw living art galleries melted into slag. They witnessed the methodical extermination of beings whose only crime was existing on a world rich in quantum crystals. But the worst part wasn't the destruction itself. It was the audio feed from the Zephyrian command channels during the attack. Kethvar's own voice, younger and full of arrogant confidence, giving orders to maximize the harvest efficiency and don't waste ammunition on the non-combatants. The broadcast lasted for 4 hours, covering every detail of the Zerian Prime massacre. When it ended, half of the surviving Zephyrian crew members had requested permission to enter voluntary hibernation rather than face what was coming next. Admiral, Communications Officer Yelatiach announced, "The Verdanian world ship is hailing us directly." Kethvar accepted the transmission, and Speaker Velandra's image appeared before him. "Did you learn anything from that experience, Admiral?" she asked. "Oui." Kethvar found himself unable to form words. He had watched the massacre of Zerian Prime countless times during the actual campaign, reviewing tactical footage to improve future operations. But seeing it now, through the eyes of the victims, was devastating. "Tomorrow, we will show you the destruction of my homeworld," Velandra continued. "The day after that, we will review the strip mining of the Forge Worlds. We have detailed documentation of every atrocity your empire committed over the past 50 years. Every planet burned, every species enslaved, every child murdered. Why are you doing this to us?" Kethvar whispered. "Because you asked for forgiveness," she replied. "True forgiveness cannot exist without true understanding. You must comprehend the magnitude of what you have done before any meaningful redemption is possible." The transmission ended, and Kethvar slumped into his command chair. Around him, his bridge crew stared at their instruments in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Science Officer Courtmel finally spoke. "Admiral, how did they survive? Our intelligence reports showed complete planetary sterilization of the Verdanian system." "I don't know," Kethvar admitted. "But clearly our intelligence was wrong about a great many things." The answer came with the second day's broadcast. This time, the transmission began with images of the Verdanian homeworld before the attack. It was a paradise of living forests and singing rivers, where the tree-like inhabitants had built their civilization in harmony with their planet's ecosystem. Cities grew from living wood, powered by the planet's natural energy flows. Their technology was based on biotechnology and symbiosis rather than conquest and exploitation. Then came the Zephyrian attack footage again, but this time with additional context. The Verdanians had detected the Zephyrian fleet weeks before the attack. Instead of preparing weapons or military defenses, they had begun something called the deep dreaming. The images showed thousands of Verdanians connecting themselves to their world's root network, their bodies becoming part of the planet's neural system. As the Zephyrian bombardment began, the planet itself seemed to respond. The forests began to sink into the ground. Rivers changed course. Mountains rearranged themselves. The Verdanians didn't die, Speaker Velandra's voice narrated over the images. They merged with their world's consciousness and went into hibernation, waiting for the destroyers to leave. "We spent 3 years slowly rebuilding, and 5 more years preparing for this moment." The implications were staggering. If the Verdanians could survive planetary bombardment, what other extinct species might still be alive? "Admiral," Tactical Officer Murndo called out, his voice tight with panic. "I'm detecting massive energy signatures from the outer system. Something big is coming through the jump points." Kethvar looked at the tactical display and felt his heart stop beating. Hundreds of new contacts were appearing throughout the solar system. Ships from dozens of different civilizations, all bearing the energy signatures of species the Zephyrian Empire had supposedly wiped out decades ago. "How many?" he asked weakly. "Current count is over 800 vessels, and climbing, sir." "Admiral, I'm seeing ship designs from the Spiral War, the Nexus campaign, even some that look like they're from the first expansion conflicts." These are representatives from every major campaign the Empire has conducted in the last century. The communication array activated again, showing not just Speaker Valandra, but hundreds of alien faces representing species from across the galaxy. Some Kethvar recognized from historical records of Zephyrian victories. Others were completely unknown. Admiral Kethvar, Valandra said, "Allow me to introduce the survivors of your Empire's reign of terror. We have been waiting a long time to have this conversation." As Kethvar stared at the assembled representatives of the dead, he began to understand that his fleet hadn't surrendered to Earth or any single species. They had surrendered to the ghosts of an empire built on genocide, and those ghosts had come to collect their due. The third day brought revelations that shattered everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about the galaxy. The broadcast began with tactical recordings from their own military archives, showing the complete destruction of the Spiral Nebula civilizations 30 years ago. But then, the images shifted to show what had really happened. The Spiral civilizations hadn't been destroyed, they had been transformed. The energy-based beings had learned to exist in spaces between dimensions, becoming living refugees in the quantum foam of reality itself. They had spent 3 decades evolving beyond physical matter, becoming beings of pure consciousness and will. "We watched you celebrate our extinction," the representative of the Spiral Collective said, its form shifting between patterns of light and geometric impossibilities. "We watched you strip our worlds bare and turn our star nurseries into mining operations. And we learned." Similar stories emerged from every species. The aquatic civilizations of the deep current had retreated to the ocean floors of their worlds, developing technologies that could survive in the crushing depths and radiation-poisoned waters left by Zephyrian orbital bombardment. The Memory Keepers had preserved the consciousness and cultural records of 43 extinct species, keeping them alive in vast quantum storage matrices. Even more disturbing was the revelation that many of these survivor civilizations had been in contact with each other for years. While the Zephyrian Empire celebrated its victories and expanded its territory, the survivors had been building a shadow network of communication and cooperation that spanned the galaxy. "You created us," Speaker Valandra explained during that day's transmission. "Your Empire's cruelty forced us to evolve, to cooperate, to become something new. We are not the same species you tried to exterminate. We are something you made us become." The fourth day brought the most devastating revelation of all. The broadcast began with images of Earth 3 years ago, when the Zephyrian invasion fleet had first arrived. The expected easy conquest that would add another primitive world to the Empire's collection. But the humans had done something unexpected. Instead of simply defending themselves, they had reached out to the survivor civilizations. Earth scientists had detected the quantum communication networks the survivors had been using for decades. Instead of reporting the discovery to galactic authorities or trying to exploit it, humanity had simply introduced themselves and asked if they could help. The humans were the first species in our experience to encounter evidence of our existence and respond with curiosity rather than fear or greed, the representative of the Crystalline Collective explained. "They offered us something we had never experienced before, alliance without conquest." The images showed human scientists working alongside Verdanian biotechnicians, human engineers collaborating with Spiral Collective energy shapers, human diplomats learning the complex communication methods of species that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But, most importantly, the humans had done something that surprised everyone. They had insisted on preparing for this moment. Not Earth's defense, which they could have managed alone with their new allies, but this specific confrontation with the Zephyrian Empire. "The humans convinced us that simple revenge would only create more victims," Speaker Valandra said. "They proposed something unprecedented in galactic history, a truth and reconciliation process that could potentially break the cycle of violence that has dominated this region of space for centuries." Admiral Kethvar realized with growing horror that Earth hadn't just defeated the Zephyrian Empire. They had orchestrated this entire scenario. The human fleet that had systematically dismantled Zephyrian military forces over the past 3 years hadn't been acting alone. They had been coordinating with a galaxy-wide alliance of survivor civilizations. "You planned all of this," he said during that evening's communication session. Admiral Chin appeared on the holographic display, her expression serious but not unkind. We plan to give you a choice, Admiral. The same choice you gave to every civilization your empire conquered. What choice is that? Learn to coexist with your neighbors, or face the consequences of your actions. As the fourth day ended, Kethvar finally understood the true magnitude of what was happening. His empire hadn't just lost a war. They had triggered the birth of a new galactic civilization based on cooperation between species they had tried to exterminate. The Zephyrian Empire's greatest victims had become its judges, and humanity had given them the tools to transform their pain into something that could potentially heal the galaxy. The question now was whether the Zephyrians were capable of transformation themselves, or if they would become just another extinct species remembered only in the Memory Keeper's vast archives. The fifth day began with silence. For the first time since the survivor fleets had arrived at Earth, no broadcasts were transmitted to the Zephyrian vessels. No historical footage of atrocities played on their screens. No voices spoke of pain and loss and the long road to recovery. Instead, Admiral Kethvar found himself staring at tactical displays showing nearly 1,000 alien vessels arranged in perfect formation around his 12 remaining ships. Each vessel represented a different survivor civilization, their technologies ranging from the barely comprehensible to the completely impossible. Admiral, Communications Officer Yelatiech announced, her voice hoarse from days of weeping over the broadcast footage. Incoming transmission from the Earth vessel Harmony. Admiral Chin's face appeared on the holographic display, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a figure that made Kethvar's skin crawl with recognition. General Marcus Webb, the human military leader who had personally commanded the assault that had destroyed the Zephyrian Third Fleet. Admiral Kethvar, Chin began. Today begins the next phase of this process. General Webb will be facilitating a series of direct dialogues between your people and the survivors. Webb stepped forward, his scarred face showing the results of 3 years of brutal space combat. Admiral, I'm going to be honest with you. I've spent the last 3 years killing your people. I've destroyed your ships, conquered your colonies, and ended the military careers of some of the most experienced officers in your empire. Kethvar said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every word was true. But today, Webb continued, I want to try something different. Today, we're going to see if it's possible for your people to understand what you've done and find a way to make amends for it. What do you mean by amends? Kethvar asked. That depends on what the survivors decide. Chin replied. Some want justice. Some want restoration. Some want guarantees that this can never happen again. A few want something more complex, which is, they want to understand you. They want to know how an entire civilization can become so committed to causing suffering that they nearly exterminated half the galaxy. The transmission ended, and Kethvar was left to contemplate that question. How had his people become monsters? When had the Zephyrian Empire crossed the line from expansion to extermination? The answer came with the first personal dialogue session. Kethvar found himself alone in his quarters, facing a holographic projection of Speaker Valandra. The Verdanian representative sat in what appeared to be a living chair made of intertwined branches, her bark-like skin showing the patterns of stress that came from years of hiding and regrowth. Tell me about your childhood, Admiral, she said simply. The question caught him completely off guard. My childhood? Yes, before you became a military commander. Before you learned to see other species as resources to be harvested. What were you like as a young Zephyrian? Kethvar considered refusing to answer, but something in Valandra's tone made him hesitate. This wasn't an interrogation. It was something else entirely. I grew up on Zephyr Prime, he said slowly. My family ran a bioengineering facility. We developed new strains of food crops that could grow in hostile environments. To help feed hungry populations? Yes, Kethvar admitted. My parents were proud of their work. They saved lives by making it possible to grow food on worlds that couldn't support natural agriculture. When did you decide to join the military? Kethvar thought back to those early years, before the Empire's expansion had consumed everything. There was a crisis on one of the outer colonies. A plague was wiping out their crops, and the population was starving. The military organized relief missions to deliver emergency supplies. You wanted to help. I wanted to serve my people. I thought. I thought the military existed to protect Zephyrian citizens and help those in need. Velandra nodded slowly. What changed? That question opened a floodgate of memories that Kethvar had buried for decades. He remembered his first assignment to a contact mission with a primitive species. The original plan had been to establish trade relations and offer technological assistance. But then, the surveys had revealed that the species' homeworld was rich in rare minerals. The politicians changed the mission parameters, he said quietly. Instead of offering help, we were ordered to secure mining rights. When the natives refused, we were told to take what we needed for the greater good of the empire. And you followed those orders. Yes. The admission felt like swallowing glass. I told myself it was for the greater good, that the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few, that a few primitive beings were a small price to pay for the prosperity of billions of Zephyrian citizens. When did it stop feeling wrong? Kethvar closed his eyes, remembering promotion ceremonies and commendation awards and parades celebrating military victories. I don't know. Somewhere along the way, it just became normal. Other species weren't really people anymore. They were obstacles to progress or resources to be managed. And you never questioned this? How could I? Everyone around me believed the same thing. Our entire civilization was built on the idea that we were superior, that we had the right to take what we needed from inferior species. To question, that would be to question everything we were. Velandra was quiet for a long moment. Admiral, do you know what my people called your species when we first encountered you? Destroyers? Invaders? The Lost Gardeners. Kethvar looked up in surprise. What? Our first contact with Zephyrian civilization was through your agricultural exports. We traded with your merchants, learned about your bioengineering techniques, studied your approaches to terraforming and ecosystem management. We thought you were the galaxy's caretakers. The words hit Kethvar like a physical blow. We were once. Yes. And somehow, you forgot that. Your species had the knowledge and ability to make worlds bloom with life. Instead, you chose to strip them bare and leave them dead. The session ended with Kethvar sitting alone in his quarters, staring at his hands, and remembering what it felt like to believe in helping people instead of conquering them. Similar sessions were taking place throughout the Zephyrian fleet. Each survivor representative was conducting personal dialogues with different crew members, slowly uncovering the individual stories that had led to collective atrocity. Science Officer Courtmel spoke with a representative of the Crystalline Collective, a being of living mineral who had once been an artist before learning to become a warrior for survival. The conversation revealed that Courtmel had originally been a xenobiologist, fascinated by the diversity of life in the galaxy. His research had been used to develop more efficient ways to exploit alien ecosystems. Communications Officer Yellow found herself talking to one of the Deep Current, an aquatic being whose species had survived by hiding in the deepest ocean trenches of their poisoned world. Yellow had been a linguist before the war, passionate about learning new languages and communication methods. Her skills had been used to decode alien transmissions and locate civilian populations for relocation. Each dialogue session revealed the same pattern. Zephyrian military personnel who had started their careers wanting to serve and protect had gradually been transformed into instruments of oppression and genocide. The Empire's propaganda machine had slowly but steadily stripped away their empathy until other species were no longer seen as sentient beings deserving of consideration. But the most difficult session was the one between Tactical Officer Murndok and a representative of the Memory Keepers. The Memory Keeper appeared as a shifting pattern of light and energy, constantly flickering between different forms as it accessed the stored consciousness patterns of extinct species. When it spoke, its voice carried the harmonics of 43 different languages. "We remember you, Murndok of the 7th Tactical Wing," the being said. "We have recordings of your voice giving targeting coordinates for the bombardment of Kepler's garden." Murndok stared at the shifting light pattern, his face pale. "You have recordings? We have everything. Every transmission, every order, every moment of that campaign. Would you like to hear yourself directing the destruction of the Children's Sanctuary?" "No," Murndok whispered. The Children's Sanctuary housed 3,000 young beings from 12 different species. They were refugees from previous Zephyrian campaigns, being cared for by volunteer workers from across the galaxy. I know what it was. Do you remember what you said when your subordinate questioned the targeting data? Murndok closed his eyes. I said they were future enemy combatants, that it was more efficient to eliminate them before they could grow up to oppose the Empire. Yes, you condemned 3,000 children to death with those words. I know. Do you know what happened to the volunteer workers? They died in the bombardment. No, they didn't. Murndok looked up in surprise. What? The memory keepers were among the volunteer workers at that facility. When your bombardment began, we initiated emergency consciousness transfer protocols. We absorbed the dying thoughts and memories of everyone in that sanctuary. The light pattern shifted, and suddenly, Murndok could hear voices. Hundreds of them, calling out in languages he didn't recognize. The voices of children crying for their parents. The voices of caregivers trying to comfort the terrified young ones, even as death approached. We carry them with us, the memory keeper explained. Every victim of every Zephyrian atrocity. Their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, their love for families they would never see again. Would you like to experience what they felt when your bombardment began? Please, Murndok begged. No. Then, you understand why forgiveness is not something we can simply grant. These voices cry out for justice every moment of every day. How do we silence their pain? How do we tell them that their deaths served some greater purpose? You can't, Murndok admitted. There is no greater purpose. We were wrong. We were evil. Yes, you were. But the question now is, what can be done about it? That question echoed throughout the Zephyrian fleet as the dialogue sessions continued over the following days. What could be done to address crimes of such magnitude? How could an entire civilization make amends for decades of systematic genocide? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez was Earth's leading expert on post-conflict reconciliation. She had spent her career studying how societies recovered from mass atrocities and civil wars. When the Zephyrian War ended, she had volunteered to help design a process that could address crimes committed on a galactic scale. Her proposal was unprecedented, the complete reconstruction of Zephyrian society from the ground up. The Zephyrian Empire cannot be reformed, she explained during a broadcast to all vessels in the system. The institutional structures, cultural values, and social systems that enabled systematic genocide must be completely dismantled and rebuilt. Admiral Kethvar listened to her proposal with growing amazement and horror. Dr. Vasquez was suggesting nothing less than the total transformation of Zephyrian civilization. All Zephyrian military forces would be disbanded permanently. The imperial government would be dissolved. The economic systems based on exploitation of conquered species would be replaced with cooperative models. Most importantly, every Zephyrian citizen would participate in a comprehensive education program designed to rebuild their understanding of ethics, empathy, and interspecies cooperation. That's impossible, Kethvar said during the response session. You're talking about changing the fundamental nature of our entire species. Yes, Dr. Vasquez replied simply. Because the fundamental nature of your species, as it currently exists, is incompatible with a peaceful galaxy. And if we refuse, then the survivor civilizations will take steps to ensure that Zephyrian aggression can never threaten anyone again. The threat was implicit but clear. The assembled survivor fleets had more than enough power to completely exterminate what remained of Zephyrian civilization. They were offering transformation as an alternative to extinction. How would such a process work? Kethvar asked. Each Zephyrian citizen would be paired with a mentor from one of the survivor civilizations. They would live and work alongside these mentors for a minimum of 5 years, learning new ways of thinking about cooperation, empathy, and responsible use of power. Zephyrian children would be educated in integrated schools with young beings from species their parents tried to exterminate. You're talking about cultural genocide. No, said Speaker Velandra, joining the transmission. We're talking about cultural healing. Your culture became a cancer that nearly destroyed this entire region of space. Surgery is required to remove the malignancy. And if the surgery is successful, then, in perhaps 50 years, when a new generation of Zephyrians has grown up learning cooperation instead of conquest, your species might be ready to rejoin galactic civilization as equals rather than predators. The proposal sparked intense debate among the surviving Zephyrian crew members. Some saw it as a chance for redemption. Others viewed it as a fate worse than death. But, as the days passed, and more details of the transformation process became clear, a consensus began to emerge. They had a choice: evolve or become extinct. The deciding factor came when the survivor representatives began sharing their visions for what a transformed Zephyrian civilization might become. Your people have incredible potential, the representative of the Spiral Collective explained. Your bioengineering expertise, your organizational abilities, your drive to achieve ambitious goals. These traits could be channeled toward healing the galaxy instead of destroying it. We could use your help rebuilding the worlds you damaged, added a representative of the Forge Masters. Your terraforming technologies, properly applied, could restore ecosystems that have been dead for decades. Most importantly, Speaker Velandra concluded, your transformation could serve as proof that change is possible, that even a civilization built on cruelty can learn to embrace compassion, that the cycle of violence that has plagued this galaxy for centuries can finally be broken. On the 10th day after the survivor fleets had arrived at Earth, Admiral Kethvar called together the commanders of the remaining Zephyrian vessels. The meeting took place via holographic conference, with representatives from all 12 damaged ships participating. We have heard the proposal, he said. We have listened to the survivors explain what our crimes have cost them. We have been offered a choice between transformation and extinction. The other commanders nodded silently. They had all participated in the dialogue sessions. They had all been forced to confront the magnitude of their empire's atrocities. I believe, Kethvar continued, that we have only one option that allows us to retain any shred of honor. Agreed, said Captain Velmore of the Crimson Dawn. We must accept the transformation process. It will mean the end of everything we thought we were, warned Captain Krendow of the Iron Resolve. Good, replied Captain Yithera of the Stormbringer. What we thought we were was a lie. Maybe it's time to discover what we actually are. The vote was unanimous. The next day, Admiral Kethvar transmitted the Zephyrian Empire's response to the assembled survivor fleets and Earth's government. We accept, he said simply. We accept the transformation process. We accept the judgment of our victims. We accept the opportunity to become something better than what we have been. The response from the survivor civilizations was immediate and surprising. Instead of the stern acceptance or grudging acknowledgement that Kethvar had expected, the assembled representatives began to sing. It started with the Verdanians, their voices carrying the rustle of wind through leaves. The crystalline collective joined in with harmonics that resonated through quantum space. The deep current added the sound of waves against distant shores. The spiral beings contributed mathematical progressions that somehow became music. Even the memory keepers participated, their shifting patterns of light pulsing in rhythm with the growing chorus. What are they doing? Communications Officer Yellow-Th asked. Admiral Chun provided the answer. They're singing the Song of New Beginnings. It's an ancient tradition among the survivor civilizations, performed when a species takes its first steps toward joining the greater galactic community. They're welcoming us? They're welcoming the species you might become. As the song continued, Admiral Kethvar realized that this moment represented more than just the end of the Zephyrian Empire. It was the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history, the voluntary transformation of an aggressive species into something capable of cooperation and peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult. 50,000 Zephyrians would have to learn entirely new ways of thinking and being. They would have to confront their past crimes every day while working to build a better future. Many would fail. Some would resist. A few might never truly change. But, for the first time in decades, Admiral Kethvar felt something he had almost forgotten how to experience: hope. The song of the survivor civilizations carried across space, reaching not just the Zephyrian vessels, but the monitoring stations of dozens of other species throughout the galaxy. Word would spread that the cycle of violence that had dominated this region of space for centuries was finally being broken. Other aggressive species would hear about the Zephyrian transformation and perhaps consider their own choices. Other victim civilizations would see that justice could take forms other than revenge. And, somewhere in the vast expanse of space, other species that had been hiding in the darkness waiting for the predators to kill each other off, might finally dare to hope that the galaxy could become a place where cooperation triumphed over conquest. The song ended, but the transformation it celebrated was just beginning. 6 months after the Song of New Beginnings, the first Zephyrian transformation facility was established on Luna, Earth's moon. The converted military base sprawled across several kilometers of the lunar surface, its biodome structures housing the most ambitious social reconstruction project in galactic history. Admiral Kethvar walked through the main corridor of what had once been his flagship's command center, now transformed into a learning complex. The walls displayed holographic artwork created by species from across the galaxy. Not the propaganda images of Zephyrian superiority he was used to, but collaborative pieces that celebrated diversity and cooperation. His mentor walked beside him, a being whose species name translated roughly as the Gardeners of Memory. HFY was humanoid in basic form but, with skin that shifted color based on emotional state, currently showing the deep blues and greens of patience and understanding. "Tell me about your dreams, Kethvar," HFY said as they paused before a memorial wall listing the names of civilizations destroyed by the Zephyrian Empire. "I don't understand the question. You've been with us for 6 months now. Your psychological profiles show significant stress patterns during sleep cycles. What do you see when you dream?" Kethvar looked at the memorial wall, his eyes finding the entry for Zirian Prime. Population 2.3 billion crystalline beings, extinct. "I see the faces of the children." "Which children?" "All of them." His voice was barely a whisper. "Every world we conquered, every species we enslaved. I see their faces, and they ask me why." HFY's skin shifted to deeper shades of blue, indicating deeper empathy. "What do you tell them?" "That I don't know. That I never thought of them as children before. That I somehow convinced myself they weren't really people." Kethvar turned away from the memorial. "But that's not good enough, is it? Ignorance doesn't excuse genocide." "No, it doesn't. But acknowledgement of guilt is the first step toward transformation." They continued walking through the facility, passing classrooms where former Zephyrian military officers learned about xenobiology from Verdanian instructors, workshops where ex-soldiers practiced conflict resolution techniques with memory keeper facilitators, and meditation gardens where crystalline collective members taught former imperial bureaucrats about interconnection and harmony. The transformation process was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. Each Zephyrian was required to spend at least 8 hours per day in direct interaction with members of species their empire had tried to exterminate. They learned new languages, studied alien cultures, and, most importantly, they listened to stories of survival and loss from beings their actions had orphaned, displaced, or traumatized. "How is Officer Yellow-TH progressing?" Kethvar asked as they passed the Communications Training Center. "She's remarkable," HFY replied. "Her linguistic abilities have allowed her to communicate directly with survivors from 17 different species. She's become one of our most effective translators for the pain-sharing sessions." The pain-sharing sessions were the most difficult part of the transformation process. Zephyrians would sit in circles with survivors and listen to detailed accounts of what they had experienced during Imperial conquest campaigns. No detail was spared. No emotion was suppressed. The former oppressors were forced to confront the full human cost of their actions. And Officer Murndok? HFY's skin darkened slightly. More challenging. He's struggling with the memory integration sessions. Kethvar wasn't surprised. Murndok had been directly responsible for some of the most brutal targeting decisions during the later conquest campaigns. The memory keepers had preserved the consciousness patterns of his victims, allowing them to share their experiences directly with their killer. "Perhaps I should speak with him," Kethvar suggested. "That might help. He respects you. And you've made significant progress in accepting responsibility for your actions." They found Murndok in one of the smaller therapy chambers, sitting across from a memory keeper whose light patterns were cycling through deep reds and purples, colors that indicated sadness and anger. Between them hung a holographic display showing the surface of a planet that Kethvar recognized from tactical reports. Kepler's Garden, the memory keeper was saying, was home to the largest interspecies orphanage in this sector of the galaxy. "We had rescued children from 40 different species whose homeworlds had been destroyed by various conflicts." Murndok sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, and his hands clenched. I know what it was. Do you? Do you truly understand what you destroyed when you directed that bombardment? Children. I killed children. Not just any children. These were beings who had already lost everything once. Their parents, their homes, their entire cultures had been wiped out by wars and disasters. The orphanage was their second chance at life. The Memory Keeper's form shifted, and, suddenly, the chamber was filled with ghostly figures, the consciousness patterns of the victims, preserved and maintained for over 3 decades. Dozens of young beings from species HFY didn't recognize, their forms flickering like candle flames in a breeze. They want to speak with you, the Memory Keeper said to Murndok. No. Murndok stood up abruptly, backing toward the door. I can't. I won't. Murndok, HFY said softly, entering the chamber. Sit down. His former tactical officer looked at him with desperate eyes. Admiral, you can't ask me to do this. You can't ask me to face them. I can and I am. Sit down. Murndok hesitated, then slowly returned to his chair. HFY took a seat beside him, facing the assembled consciousness patterns of their victims. One of the ghostly figures stepped forward, a small, humanoid child with features that suggested reptilian ancestry. When it spoke, its voice carried the innocence of youth mixed with the pain of betrayal. Why did you kill us? The child asked simply. Murndok's composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down his face as he struggled to find words. Because I thought you were enemies. We were children. I know. We were orphans. I know. We just wanted to live. I know. Murndok's voice broke. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Another consciousness pattern stepped forward, this one an adolescent being with crystalline features. Sorry doesn't bring us back. No, it doesn't. Sorry doesn't give us the lives we should have had. No. What does sorry actually mean when the person who killed us gets to keep living? The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Murndok looked at HFY, then back at the assembled spirits of his victims. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what my apology is worth. I don't know how to make amends for something so terrible. All I know is that I want to be different. I want to become someone who would never do what I did. The child spirit tilted its head. What would that person be like? Someone who sees children as children, no matter what species they are. Someone who protects the innocent instead of targeting them. Someone who asks, how can I help, instead of how can I destroy? And you think you can become that person? I have to try. Because if I can't, then you died for nothing. If I can't change, then no Zephyrian can change. And this whole process is meaningless. The consciousness patterns began to fade, but not before the reptilian child spoke one last time. We will be watching. After the session ended and the Memory Keeper had departed, HFY sat with Murndok in the empty chamber. How do you do it, Admiral? Murndok asked. How do you live with what we've done? By working every day to make sure it never happens again, HFY replied. By trying to become someone worthy of the chance we've been given. Do you think we'll succeed? The transformation project, I mean. HFY considered the question carefully. I think some of us will. Others won't. But if enough of us change, if we can raise our children to be better than we were, then maybe we can honor the memory of our victims by becoming the species we should have been all along. Outside the therapy chamber, the transformation facility buzzed with activity. In the agricultural labs, former Zephyrian terraforming specialists worked alongside Verdanian bioengineers to develop new techniques for restoring damaged ecosystems. In the engineering workshops, ex-Imperial technicians collaborated with Forge Master artificers to design tools for construction rather than destruction. But, perhaps most importantly, in the education centers, Zephyrian children who had been born into the Empire's final years were learning to see the galaxy through entirely different eyes. HFY made his way to the primary school, where his daughter Velina was attending her daily interspecies cooperation class. At 8 years old, she was part of the first generation of Zephyrians to grow up surrounded by diverse alien cultures rather than Imperial propaganda. He found her in the art studio, working on a collaborative sculpture with a young Verdanian named Ashtel and a juvenile representative of the crystalline collective called Harmony. The 3 children were combining organic materials from Verdania with crystal formations from Zirian and biometal from Zephyr Prime to create something entirely new. Papa, Velina called out when she saw him. Look what we're making. The sculpture was unlike anything in traditional Zephyrian art, where imperial aesthetics emphasized dominance and conquest. This piece celebrated growth, harmony, and mutual support. The crystal components provided structure, the organic materials brought life and flexibility, and the biometal connected everything together in patterns that seemed to flow like water. It's beautiful, Kethvar said, and meant it. What does it represent? Friendship, Ashtel replied, her bark-like skin showing the patterns of joy and contentment. Unity, added harmony, their crystalline form chiming softly in harmonious tones. Home, Velina concluded. It represents all of us living together as friends. Kethvar felt his chest tighten with emotion. His daughter was creating art that celebrated the very beings he had spent decades trying to destroy. She was learning empathy where he had been taught hatred, cooperation where he had learned conquest. Papa, Velina said, looking up at him with eyes that held none of the prejudice that had been programmed into his generation. Teacher Eshtai says that you used to be a soldier. Did you fight against Ashtel's people and Harmony's people? The question hit him like a physical blow. His daughter deserved an honest answer. But how could he explain to an 8-year-old that her father had been a war criminal responsible for genocide? Yes, he said simply. I did fight against them. I did terrible things that I can never undo. Velina considered this information with the serious expression that children sometimes adopted when wrestling with complex ideas. But you're not fighting anymore. No, I'm not fighting anymore. And you're friends with Teacher Eshtai now. Yes. So people can change? Some people can change. If they work very hard and have help from good teachers and friends. Ashtel looked up from the sculpture, her young face showing curiosity rather than fear or anger. My grandmother remembers the old times, before the burning. She says that change is possible for everyone, but only if they really want to change. Do you want to change, Admiral Kethvar? Harmony asked, their voice creating musical harmonics that somehow conveyed genuine interest. More than anything, he replied, I want to become someone that your people can trust. Someone that my daughter can be proud of. Then, you will, Velina said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. Because wanting to change is the first step, and working hard is the second step, and having friends help is the third step. Teacher Eshtai taught us that. As Kethvar watched his daughter return to her artwork, collaborating seamlessly with children from species he had tried to exterminate, he felt something he had thought was lost forever, hope for the future. That evening, the transformation facility held its monthly progress review. Representatives from each of the survivor civilizations gathered in the main assembly hall to assess how the Zephyrians were adapting to their new lives. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the central podium, presenting statistics and psychological profiles to the assembled crowd. 43% of adult Zephyrians are showing significant progress in empathy development. 67% have successfully completed basic interspecies communication training. 89% of Zephyrian children are demonstrating healthy integration with their non-Zephyrian peers. Speaker Velandra raised one of her branch-like arms. What about the resistance cases? Approximately 15% of adult Zephyrians continue to show signs of deep-seated prejudice and aggression. These individuals require intensive therapy and may need to be kept in controlled environments indefinitely. And the others? The remainder are making slow but steady progress. The transformation process is working, but it will take years to complete. General Webb stepped forward. What about security concerns? Any signs of organized resistance or attempts to preserve imperial ideology? Dr. Vasquez shook her head. None detected. The thorough exposure to their victims' experiences has been more effective than we anticipated at breaking down ideological defenses. Most Zephyrians are so horrified by what they've learned about their empire's crimes that they're eager to help prevent similar atrocities from occurring. The representative of the Memory Keepers shifted through several different light patterns before speaking. We have a proposal for the next phase of the transformation process. What do you suggest? Admiral Chen asked. We want to establish joint colonies. Mixed populations of Zephyrians and survivor species working together to rebuild some of the worlds that were damaged during the Imperial expansion. The suggestion created a stir throughout the assembly. Putting former oppressors and their victims together in permanent settlements was an enormous risk. The psychological preparation would have to be extensive, Dr. Vasquez pointed out. And we need safeguards to prevent conflicts. We've been considering this possibility, Speaker Velandra added. Some of our damaged worlds need extensive terraforming and reconstruction work. The Zephyrians have the technical expertise we need, and working together on restoration projects could provide a meaningful way for them to make amends. Admiral Chen looked thoughtful. Which Zephyrians would be eligible for such colonies? Those who have completed the full transformation curriculum and demonstrated consistent empathy and cooperation over at least 2 years, the Memory Keeper replied. We estimate that approximately 30% of the current population would qualify within the next 5 years. Kethvar listened to the discussion from his seat in the audience, realizing that they were talking about the possibility of his people not just surviving, but actually contributing to galactic civilization again. The idea seemed almost impossible after everything they had done. But as he looked around the assembly hall, seeing former enemies working together to design a better future, he began to believe that impossible things might be possible after all. The meeting ended with the approval of a pilot program. 3 joint colonies would be established on worlds that had been damaged but not completely destroyed by Zephyrian campaigns. Carefully selected volunteers from both survivor species and reformed Zephyrians would work together to rebuild not just the physical infrastructure, but the trust that had been shattered by decades of violence. As the representatives filed out of the assembly hall, Eshtai approached Kethvar. You've been selected as a candidate for the Kepler's Garden Restoration Project, they said. Kethvar felt his blood turn cold. Kepler's Garden? But that's where the interspecies orphanage was destroyed. Yes. Eshtai's skin showed patterns of careful determination. The Memory Keepers specifically requested that you be part of the team that rebuilds it. Why? Because you need to help create something beautiful where you once created destruction. And because the children whose consciousness patterns we preserve want to see their home restored by the person who destroyed it. Kethvar stared at his mentor, struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. A chance to return to the site of one of his greatest crimes, not as a conqueror, but as a builder. An opportunity to honor the memory of victims by creating a new safe haven for vulnerable beings. When do we leave? He asked. In 6 months. Assuming you complete the Advanced Restoration Training Program. Eshtai's skin showed approval and pride. Are you ready for that challenge? Kethvar thought about his daughter, creating art that celebrated unity instead of conquest. He thought about Mern Doak, finally, beginning to face the spirits of his victims. He thought about the thousands of Zephyrians who were slowly learning to see the galaxy through eyes of compassion rather than greed. Yes, he said, I'm ready. The transformation of the Zephyrian Empire was far from complete, but, for the first time in decades, their future pointed toward creation rather than destruction. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it led somewhere worth reaching. A galaxy where former enemies could become partners in building something better than what had come before. 3 years after the first joint colony ship left Earth's orbit, the Kepler's Garden Restoration Project had become something unprecedented in galactic history. What had once been a barren, radiation-scorched world was slowly transforming into a living monument to cooperation between former enemies. Kethvar stood on a hillside overlooking the construction site of the new interspecies sanctuary, watching teams of workers from 12 different species collaborate on the massive project. Former Zephyrian terraforming specialists worked alongside Verdanian bioengineers to restore the planet's damaged ecosystem. Memory Keepers provided detailed records of what the original sanctuary had looked like, while crystalline collective artisans grew new structures from living stone. But the most remarkable sight was the children. Over 100 young beings from across the galaxy played in the newly established temporary housing complex below. Some were refugees from recent conflicts in distant sectors. Others were orphans created by the chaos that had followed the collapse of the Zephyrian Empire. A few were actually young Zephyrians, children of the colonists who were growing up as part of the first truly integrated interspecies community in modern history. The memorial garden is ready for the ceremony, announced Eshtai, approaching from behind with their characteristic, quiet footsteps. Over the past 3 years, Kethvar's mentor had become something closer to a friend, though the weight of history would always color their relationship. Kethvar nodded, feeling the familiar knot of emotion in his chest that came whenever he thought about what they were building here. Are the memory keepers prepared? They've been preparing for 34 years, HFY replied. This is what they've been waiting for. The memorial garden occupied the exact location where the original orphanage's main building had stood. Instead of trying to recreate what had been lost, the designers had created something entirely new, a living space where the consciousness patterns of the victims could finally find peace. At the center of the garden stood a structure that defied easy description. It combined Verdanian bioarchitecture with crystalline collective quantum resonance technology and Zephyrian energy manipulation systems. The result was something that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in the quantum dimensions where the memory keepers stored their preserved consciousness patterns. Will they be able to speak with us directly? Kethvar asked. More than that, HFY replied. For the first time since their deaths, they'll be able to manifest as independent entities rather than just memory fragments. The memorial will serve as a bridge between the preserved consciousness patterns and the physical world. The implications were staggering. The children who had died in the original bombardment would be able to interact with the living children who would grow up in the rebuilt sanctuary. The past and future would meet in a way that had never been possible before. As they walked down toward the memorial garden, they passed construction crews putting finishing touches on the new sanctuary buildings. The architecture was revolutionary, structures that could adapt to the environmental needs of dozens of different species simultaneously. Atmospheric control systems that could maintain different gas mixtures in adjacent rooms. Gravity manipulation technology that allowed beings from high-gravity and low-gravity worlds to share the same spaces comfortably. Kethvar called a familiar voice from one of the construction sites. He turned to see Murndok emerging from what would become the sanctuary's main dining facility. Over the past 3 years, his former tactical officer had transformed almost beyond recognition. The rigid military bearing was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who spent his days working with delicate equipment and vulnerable beings. His face showed lines of care rather than command authority. The kitchen systems are operational, Murndok reported. We can accommodate 47 different dietary requirements simultaneously, with room for expansion as we encounter new species. Excellent work, Kethvar replied, and meant it. Murndok had thrown himself into the practical aspects of sanctuary construction with the dedication of someone seeking redemption through service. Admiral, Murndok said, then corrected himself. Kethvar, I wanted to ask you something. What is it? After the memorial ceremony tonight, after we've spoken with them, what happens next? It was a question that had been weighing on all of the Zephyrian colonists. They had spent 3 years building this place, learning to work with their former victims, struggling to become people worthy of the second chance they'd been given. But what came after redemption? I don't know, Kethvar admitted. I suppose we keep working, keep building, keep trying to be better than we were. But will it ever be enough? Can we ever truly make amends for what we did? HFY interrupted gently. That's not a question you should be asking yourself, Murndok. That's a question only our people can answer. The ceremony began at sunset, when Kepler's garden star painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Representatives from every survivor civilization had gathered in the memorial garden, along with the Zephyrian colonists and the children who would soon call this place home. Speaker Velandra stood before the quantum resonance structure at the garden's heart, her bark-like skin showing patterns of both sadness and hope. Today, we bridge the gap between death and life, between past and future, between pain and healing. She placed her hands on the bioorganic control interface, and the memorial structure began to glow with soft, warm light. The air itself seemed to shimmer as reality bent around the quantum bridge. One by one, they appeared. The consciousness patterns of the 3,000 children who had died in the original bombardment began to manifest as translucent, but clearly visible forms. They looked exactly as they had in life. Young beings from dozens of different species, their faces showing the innocence and curiosity that had been stolen from them. But there was something else in their expressions now. Peace, understanding, forgiveness. The reptilian child who had spoken to Murndok during his therapy sessions stepped forward, their form more solid and real than it had ever been in the Memory Keeper's storage matrices. "We have been watching," the child said, their voice carrying clearly across the garden. "We have seen what you have built here." Kethvar stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "We tried to honor your memory, to create something worthy of the lives that were lost." "You have done more than that," replied the crystalline adolescent who had questioned the meaning of apology years before. "You have created hope for the future." Other spirits began to speak, their voices overlapping in a harmony that seemed to resonate through the quantum dimensions themselves. "We see the children who will grow up here, learning cooperation instead of conquest. We see former enemies working together to protect the innocent. We see the cycle of violence finally broken. We see redemption earned through service and sacrifice. The memorial garden filled with more than just the spirits of the dead." The living children from the temporary housing complex had begun to arrive, drawn by curiosity and wonder at the glowing figures in the garden. Young Zephyrians approached the spirits of beings their parents' generation had killed, but there was no fear on either side. Velina, now 11 years old and one of the project's most effective interspecies mediators, walked up to the reptilian child spirit with the natural confidence that came from growing up in an integrated community. "Are you really ghosts?" she asked with childlike directness. The spirit smiled, an expression of joy that transcended species boundaries. "We are memories given form. We are the past speaking to the future. What do you want to tell us?" "That love is stronger than hate. That creation is more powerful than destruction. That the choice to be kind is always available, no matter what has come before." Around the garden, similar conversations were taking place as the living and the dead found ways to communicate across the boundaries of existence. Children who had never known war spoke with the spirits of children who had never known peace. Zephyrian colonists who had spent years learning to feel genuine remorse faced the forgiveness of their victims. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Murndok approached the cluster of spirits representing the beings he had personally targeted for destruction. "I know I can never undo what I did to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," the reptilian child agreed. "You cannot undo it. But you can build something beautiful on the foundation of our memory. Is that enough?" "Look around you," the crystalline adolescent said. "Look at this place you have built. Look at the children who will grow up safe because of the work you have done. Look at the future you have made possible." Murndok looked around the garden, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. The memorial wasn't just a monument to the dead, it was a promise to the living. A guarantee that this place would serve as a sanctuary for vulnerable beings for generations to come. "It's a beginning," he said. "Yes, it's a beginning." As the ceremony continued, the quantum bridge began to stabilize in ways that the designers hadn't expected. The spirits weren't fading back into the Memory Keeper's storage matrices. Instead, they were taking on permanent form, anchored to the memorial structure in a way that would allow them to exist as ongoing guardians of the sanctuary. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had traveled from Earth to witness the ceremony, approached Speaker Valandra with barely concealed excitement. "This is unprecedented," she said. "The consciousness patterns are achieving stable manifestation. They're becoming permanent residents of this place." "It seems appropriate," Valandra replied. "They died here. Now they can live here again, watching over the children who need protection." The implications for the future were enormous. The Kepler's Garden Sanctuary wouldn't just be a safe haven for orphaned and refugee children. It would be a place where the wisdom of the past could directly guide the growth of the future. As the formal ceremony concluded and the various representatives began to disperse, Kethvar found himself standing alone with the memorial structure. The spirits of the children remained visible, now permanent fixtures of the garden they would help protect. "You have given us something we never expected," the reptilian child said to him. "What's that?" "The chance to see our deaths transformed into something meaningful. The opportunity to help raise the children who will inherit the galaxy we could never grow up to see." "Thank you," Kethvar said simply. "Thank you for forgiving us. Thank you for giving us the chance to become something better." "Forgiveness was never ours to give or withhold," the crystalline adolescent replied. "Forgiveness is something you had to find within yourselves. We could only provide the motivation." As Kethvar walked back toward the colonial settlement, he reflected on how completely his understanding of justice had changed over the past 4 years. Justice wasn't just punishment for wrongdoing. It was the creation of systems that prevented future wrongdoing. Justice wasn't just making amends to victims. It was ensuring that no new victims would be created. The Kepler's Garden Sanctuary would soon house over 500 children from across the galaxy. They would grow up in a community where diversity was celebrated, where cooperation was the norm, and where the spirits of past victims served as guardians and teachers. But, more importantly, the sanctuary served as proof that transformation was possible on any scale. If former genocidal imperialists could learn to dedicate their lives to protecting the innocent, then perhaps any conflict could be resolved through patience, understanding, and commitment to change. The next morning brought news that would reshape the entire galactic situation. Admiral Chen's voice came over the communication arrays with barely contained excitement. Attention all colonies and settlements. We're receiving signals from the Outer Rim territories. Species we've never encountered before are requesting permission to establish contact. Kethvar joined the emergency meeting in the sanctuary's main conference room, where representatives from all the colony's major factions had gathered around the holographic communication display. How many species are we talking about? Speaker Velandra asked. Initial count suggests at least 30 different civilizations, Admiral Chen replied. They've been monitoring our transmissions about the transformation project. Apparently, word of the Zephyrian rehabilitation program has spread throughout this entire region of the galaxy. What do they want? Asked the representative of the Memory Keepers. They want to join us. They want to be part of a galactic community based on cooperation rather than conquest. But more than that, Chen paused, clearly still processing the magnitude of what she was about to say. Some of them want to undergo transformation processes of their own. The implications hit the conference room like a shockwave. The Zephyrian transformation hadn't just rehabilitated a single species. It had inspired a galactic revolution in how civilizations dealt with conflict and aggression. We're going to need more facilities, Dr. Vasquez said, her mind already racing with the logistical challenges. More than that, Eshtai added, we're going to need to completely reimagine our approach to interspecies relations. If dozens of civilizations want to voluntarily transform themselves, we're looking at the birth of an entirely new type of galactic community. Kethvar listened to the discussion with a growing sense of awe. For years ago, he had commanded a fleet bent on conquest and extermination. Now, he was part of a movement that was transforming the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. What's our capacity for expansion? He asked. Limited, Dr. Vasquez admitted. The transformation process requires intensive one-on-one mentoring and extensive psychological support. We can't just scale it up indefinitely without maintaining quality. Then, we train more mentors, suggested Murndok. Some of the Zephyrians who have completed the full transformation process could help guide members of other species. The idea was radical. Former war criminals serving as counselors and teachers for other beings struggling with their own capacity for violence. But it made sense. Who better to recognize the signs of destructive thinking than someone who had overcome it themselves? We could establish a network of transformation centers throughout this sector, Speaker Velandra mused, each one focusing on different aspects of the rehabilitation process. And the children, added the Memory Keeper.